Thanks for clicking on this video. In this track, we talked about building culture, and we're joined by Ed Young, the president of Universal Health Screener. We discussed provocations like culture and identity, and questions like why do we trust people who have shared cultural experiences? I loved this episode, and I think you will too. So without further ado, enjoy the track. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Ashley Lynn. I'm 17 from Vancouver, Washington, and today I am joined by some of our amazing CU community members and a special guest. Our topic today is building culture, and we will start off with a word association. So just say 1 to 3 words that you associate with building culture and tell us why. So Allison, we can kick it off with you.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Allison. I'm a sophomore in high school and I'm from Ohio. And word association wise, I would say workplace and values, because I think culture kind of lies a lot in the workplace, in a team wise, and also usually culture has like a similar kind of values, similar visions and everything.
Hi, my name is Chabu Kapumba. I am 19 and based in Toronto, and my word of association for building culture is alignment and evolution. I think there isn't a single culture out there that isn't in a constant state of evolution, and the overarching goal really is to make it in alignment with values, the people that are there, the time and place, and also just like the goals of that space. So when I think of building culture, these are my 2 words.
Hi everyone, I'm Madison. I'm a high school senior from Oklahoma, and I would say my 3 words are intentional, not controlling, because when you're designing or building a culture, you can be very intentional about what you want the outcome to be or kind of the general direction of what you want the end product to be, but you cannot control what that is through any of your particular design choices.
Hi everyone, my name is Maryam. I'm 17 from the suburbs of Chicago. And I was also going to say intentional, but instead I'll say community and purposeful, because community plays a huge part in building culture among the community members. And then you definitely have to be purposeful in cultivating and empowering an uplifting culture.
Hi everyone, I'm Roman. I'm a sophomore from Maryland and I'm 15. And my 2 words of association would be free-flowing and multicultural. So I think that whenever you build a culture, you're obviously going to be working with a diverse group of people. And so ideas and different values need to be able to go around from person to person in a sort of free way, like a lot of other people said, non-controlling. And you also need to accept all the other cultures and accept all the other ideas to form one kind of melting pot unified culture. So yeah.
I guess I'm Ed Young, and I'm not in high school anymore. And I would say family, history, and community. I'm going to say community again, because I think those things build upon and are interrelated one to another. And culture is the synthesis of all of those things for each one of us. And, this is going to be an interesting conversation, because everything you all are saying just is really insightful. I'm impressed already. So.
Well, hey, I'm Gary. I'm calling in from New York. I think my words are step by step. I think you can, if you try to do too much at a time, and you're not kind of iterative about it, you don't run a bunch of experiments, it's, nothing can happen. I've tried to do that before, and that's been the case. You can have a lot of good intentions, but I think step by step is often a really great way to figure out what culture you want to build.
Awesome, cool. Yeah. Great. And when I think of culture, I just think of like all encompassing, I think, and like religion. I don't know. I guess I see like religion as like a vehicle for cultural transformation, and just culture is encompassing in the sense that, so many like processes and rituals and like norms are grounded in culture. And oftentimes whenever we make decisions, like it comes from like a place of like what are our cultural narratives, and a lot of decisions stem from that. Yeah, does anyone have a question that they would like to start us off with?
I guess I just wanted to ask something specifically on what you said, Ashley. When you say religion, I'm assuming that you mean it in a kind of more like general sense, like not necessarily like any specific religion or even a religion that like believes in some sort of faith, but just kind of a group of shared norms and shared ideals that comes from like the same like general beliefs. Is that what you were getting at? Or I just want to make sure.
Yeah, yes,
Mhm.
definitely just religion in the sense of like, yeah, like having some sort of like shared like practices and norms and like values that people hold, as like a way to guide our decisions.
So I have a provocation that's actually in direct reaction to Ashley's word of association. I think it's really important that she brought up the word religion, because it is one of like the more core pillars of culture when people think about it. And so my provocation is core concepts of culture.
I would say that one of the core concepts is that culture has to bring people together, and the practices within it have to make people feel a sense of community. I think that something I've especially learned through the design of digital first communities like the CU Fellowship is that because everything is so opt-in, people really have to want to participate, and they have to feel like they're having a need met that isn't met in other places. And I think the same applies for things in like American culture or like religion, is it makes you feel closer to other people, and I guess fulfills a need that is not otherwise fulfilled in another place in your life.
I definitely agree with Madison in the sense that so much of it is like grounded in people. I'm also really inspired by how it's regional. So like a core concept of culture to me is definitely like where it's grounded from or where it comes from, because that can be a really great way of just like coming to understand different, almost like versions of being and reality and going about life and different senses of priority. And so I think that that's something worth embracing. And so just like that regional component of like where it actually comes from is really cool to see.
Definitely. And I think that like there's even subsets of culture. So like, for example, if I'm talking to someone from Michigan, then I'll have my Illinois culture and they'll have their Michigan culture. But if we're in a national setting and there's someone, for example, from the East Coast or the West Coast, then like we will band together over like our Midwestern culture, if that makes sense. So I think that like culture definitely has subsets related to like geographically or like the different people that are in it, which could be another like grounding part of what culture is, because it's not something static. It definitely is dynamic and can change just depending on the people that are in a particular group at a time.
Yeah, and to kind of add on to that, I wanted to also kind of talk about the sense that culture is built on people. And so culture has to, yes, be communal, yes, be collective, but it also has to be individual. You also need some sense of people being able to interpret their culture, their values in their own meaning, so that, you know, because you're not always going to be exactly in the place that your culture is born. For example, if your culture is based, like Maryam was saying, in Illinois, you're not always going to be in Illinois. And so if you're, you know, abroad or in some place where your culture isn't familiar, you still need to be able to have an individual sense of your culture, which makes it adaptable, which makes it, you know, more flexible. So I think there's definitely a large part in having the ability to, yeah, like Madison saying, yeah, everyone celebrates Christmas differently. We all do it like similarly, but there's still some sense of individuality. So I think that's important too.
Just to kind of riff on what Chabu was saying about regional, I don't, I think technology has allowed us to create basically digital regions, right? Digital spaces where cultures can be formed, and I think that's really, really powerful. I think that's happening most in Gen Z, at least that I've observed, that there's like internet cultures that are really, really powerful. I mean, I was just listening to a podcast as well about like the BTS culture, like the boy band from Korea. They have like there are like sub communities have like hundreds of thousands and millions of members, right? They're spread all across the world, and they literally talk about how like the fact that they're all in the BTS army creates like this shared like connection that like people in the army will host each other when they're visiting different countries.
Right, but you can be Sugar or V or one of the other five, you know, within that army. So there are divisions in the army.
Yes.
It's a great example that, you know, it shows. Roman, to your point, it's very interesting because culture is atomized. It starts arguably with your family or unit or whatever, and then you go out and you experience different things, live different places, and you become acculturated. And that goes with you. And so it's you know, I'm listening to you all and like, what is culture? Is it personality? Is it our characteristics? Or, you know, we each carry a culture with us, as you were saying. And so it's one of those things. It can be a good thing or it can be a negative thing. You know, oftentimes people have, you know, leveled one's culture against others. And what's encouraging about, I think, the digital era and the ability of people to be far flung and experience different things has maybe lessened the ability of people to level their cultures against one another. We see it, we feel like it's more, but, you know I came up when we had pen pals, and, you know, it was a big deal. I lived in Germany as a kid. That was amazing to people, you know. And so we're more cultured in many ways than people have ever been before. And I'm a BTS fan, so.
First of all, hearing that was definitely the highlight of the day. I didn't anticipate that response. But just thinking about like stan culture specifically, it's really, really interesting because it's almost like one of my siblings is like heavily involved in that, and it's just really interesting because she'll like talk about the friends that they have, and theoretically there's nothing to have in common, but they've found a thing in common and build really, really, really deep bonds. um and so in the same way that it's like extremely divisive, I would argue that it equally has the capacity to be extremely bridging and connecting, especially as like more and more subcultures form on the internet in particular. Like Gary mentioned, there's just a plethora of opportunities to engage with people that you would normally not engage with, or if the first interaction was contingent on like seeing each other face to face, it would normally like be a brush off. So I think it's really interesting how there's almost like new ways to be introduced to people that makes you more open and perceptive to like appreciating them and getting to know them.
Yeah, and I want to pose another provocation, and I'll say it for you, Ashley, so you can write it down, and then I'll give a little bit of context. It's culture and identity. I think that a lot of things that we claim as part of our identity is because we have experience in a certain culture. What I mean by that is, say, part of my identity is like I'm from like Oklahoma. I'm from like a small town in Oklahoma, right? But like what makes this like feel like home or a huge part of who I am is because of the culture that I experience, like going to my grandma's house, going to, doing all these things. And so I think that it's really interesting to think about how like culture, like certain cultures shape how we see ourselves and how we interact with the world. Just a conversation I wanted to have.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. And I wanted to kind of pose something on that, which is that I think, at least on a personal level, I think that your culture can be the lack of one single culture. And so I bring this up kind of to what Ed was saying about, becoming more cultured over time. And it's that I grew up traveling all over the world. And so I grew up really in places because my dad was a diplomat. We moved around a lot. I grew up in places where I was kind of like the outsider. And so where most people around me didn't look like me, they didn't have the same kind of, because I'm French and American, and basically no one I was ever with was either French or American. And so I think what makes culture interesting is that paradoxically, your culture can be the lack of a culture. It can be just your own kind of individual values that are built up by experiencing and by learning from a whole bunch of other cultures. So yeah.
I'm actually having a really hard time finding the distinction between culture and identity, just thinking out loud, because in the same way that like Roman kind of mentioned, not associating with like the particular culture that you're a part of can also almost become a cultural identity. I feel like they definitely inform each other to a point where I don't even know if there's like a boundary between the two. But I can definitely say that like culture informs like my perception of my identity to an extent. So there are things that I can identify with, and then in the context of certain cultures, those are things worth embracing. And then in the context of other cultures, those are things to not quite be proud of, or things to want to almost like realign or self-assess. So I think that culture has a way of depicting the identities that exist and either making them something to like look at in a good way, or you can totally take a different perspective and see it as a bad thing.
Yeah, I resonate with that, in that like identity and culture seem very much tied together. And I guess to me, I feel like, I don't know, I just feel like that's because like culture emerges from community, and communities are created because of shared identity. And so, like the whole point of creating a culture is to create like a set of like processes that work for the people within them. So like if the people within them aren't similar to some degree, then like it wouldn't make sense for them to have a shared culture.
I definitely agree. And I feel like it doesn't have to be like a huge thing that people find a point of alignment on, but it has to be something that people are passionate about, if that makes sense. Like it can't be like, oh, we both like ice cream, because like that's not something that'll sustain itself over time, that'll like allow for like a strong community culture to develop. But if it's like, for example, in CU, we have a lot of different people from all over the place with very different backgrounds and identities, but like we all came together over like one shared mission. So I feel like that is definitely super important. And the same thing, going back to what we were talking about before, like online meeting people, I feel like is a lot easier because once you find that one shared point of connection, it's like they're not really a stranger anymore because like you both relate on one topic, and that kind of like opens a line of communication that might not have existed before. So I know like when I meet someone for the first time, I'm like, oh, we both like the show, or we both like certain things, and it kind of is easier to create those bonds. So I definitely feel like finding that one point of connection opens things up for a lot more communication after.
Yeah, I think, Mariam, that distinction between having, shared things that you enjoy, it's like the difference between liking the same thing and liking the same process. So you mentioned ice cream. Like if we both like ice cream, it's not going to be sustaining because we can't just like, I don't know, like talk about ice cream all the time. But like if we enjoy the same process, like I don't know, if you and a friend really like playing the same sport, or for CU, we enjoy having really meaningful conversations all the time. And that's the kind of shared connection that is long-term sustaining.
Yeah, to add on, kind of replying to Roman, Chabu, and Miriam, yeah, I think identity definitely shapes, no, not really. I think culture more of shapes identity. I mean, they're more of like transversal kind of, but I also think that culture can like kind of what Roman said about like how we can feel like an outsider, right? I feel like it can like also divide people up a little bit and also connect people like really strongly together. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting perspective.
Oh, I just kind of want to make the clarification that just kind of what I was talking about earlier about feeling like an outsider. The interesting thing was that and this may even occur in CU, in that when you have so many people from so many different cultures, and that those cultures are so diverse, and I wouldn't say like non-compatible, but they're not shared, right? The culture that forms is that everyone is different. Everyone is, technically like an outsider, and that you build on that. So I think that's what I was more trying to get at, not it being divisive, but it being more unifying, in that because nobody is similar, everyone shares that, like everyone shares that difference, right?
And that's what the United States of America was arguably the vision of what the US is, e pluribus unum. It's, out of many, one, but it's not one thing. It's one society made up of all of those different things. And it's, it's fascinating. You said you lived in different places and you were the outsider. When I was in Germany, I was an AFS student, if you all are familiar with American Field Service. So I had a German family I lived with, and in a town of 60,000, I was the Black population. And so it was really amazing. It was an amazing experience. But, so I was actually the cultural ambassador for something that an entire town had never experienced or had any insight into. And so, what you call culture is cultural identity. That's a term. We use that. But then you have these other parts of you that are different cultures. And what does that mean? And, what is the foundational culture that you have? And as I'm listening to you talk, part of what we're talking about in culture is part of that is the social contract that you have in order to live together collectively, different peoples. The social contract is a cultural agreement, arguably, and then there are other cultures within that as well. So, what does this mean? It's, I don't know, that's throwing it out there.
I think that for me, a phrase that's kind of stood out to what you just said, Ed, was the idea of being a cultural ambassador. Because I feel like to a degree, like I play the role of cultural ambassador like in my home, almost as like the representation of American culture to my immigrant parents. And then also having lived abroad, like I almost feel there's like the social contract of having to explain the behaviors or like why the US is the way it is. And my wholehearted answer is I have no idea. I am equally confused. But it's really interesting because when introduced to, like, if you play the role of cultural ambassador, there's a level of awareness that you are almost like the singular representation. And that's a really difficult undertaking because you can't ever do it right. There's so many nuances and depths and, personal intricacies that can never be depicted by a single person, or even two or three or 50 or etc. Which makes me think about the fact that, like, in the instances where I'm being introduced to new people or new cultures, and it's almost been contingent on one person, how do you have like the level of self-awareness to realize I don't actually know anything about this culture. I just have happened to have met someone who has a partial identity that relates to that. So cultural, like learning or cultural immersion has to be such like an ongoing recursive process because no single instance or person or experience will really embody something like that in full.
That made me think about how I was watching this YouTube like kind of citizen documentary where this one person that who's not an Orthodox Jew was able to get permission from the like this Orthodox Jewish community to like film like what life is like in that community, and I'm aware that that's just like one small subset of that community in New York, which is a small subset of the whole Orthodox Jewish community. But it can be pretty paradigm shifting, even one experience with a particular culture. But I guess what I didn't think about was how that was only one data point. But it was interesting is that some people, like a lot of people have 0 data points that are like not caricatures of some cultures. Like I didn't have any like data points about like Uyghur Muslims until, or like, I mean, still to this day, like I just know that they're being oppressed. And I think that's unfortunate. I have a question if no one else doesn't want to share a provocation or anything. Why do we trust people that have shared cultural experiences? Basically have experienced.
I think culture is one of these kind of like universal parts of human nature and the human condition. And so I think I mean, we can take this two ways. We can take it obviously like trust in a more kind of primitive way, and like why, the monkey brain inside of us trust people who tell us that they have different or similar experiences. And we can also take it in a more like philosophical way. But I guess just one of the big things about trust is that we're naturally inclined to be around people who share experiences similar to us. We're more likely to do that just because they're more similar to us. And then we can kind of feel like we're in a safer space when we're with people that are closer to us or that have the same kind of ideas as us. And so I think that the reason that we trust people who have shared cultural experiences is the same reason that we have cultures in the first place, or that we build these networks and these norms with a whole bunch of other people under one shared culture.
I think that when you're, talking to someone or engaging with someone, there's a lot of unknown. There's a lot it's safe to assume absolutely nothing. And so, but you still have to engage in some variation of risk, and like there has to be some exchange of trust. And so I think that when you are talking to someone who has shared cultural experience, because they have that shared culture experience, you can operate under the assumption that they would be shaped by the same insights and would likely make the decision that you would make for yourself. So it makes it easier to trust them because our experiences shape the decisions that we make now. And so if they have the shared experience, then they're likely to make the decision that we would have made for ourselves in that situation. So I think that it makes the exchange of trust a bit easier. But I also don't know if this is the best premise to operate from when like engaging with people either.
For sure. I feel like it makes people more familial in the sense of like you share at least one thing where it's like, oh, with my family, I share something, but it's also like, oh, with my friend or a friend of a friend, like, that there's like something that has already been validated before you even interact with them. And I think it's almost like the idea of stranger danger. We're like indoctrinated with this idea that like, oh, like foreigners like bad, like this isn't good. You gotta like be really wary. But then once you have that like in almost where you're like, oh, here's a point of connection where someone's either made it for you or the shared cultural experience has like facilitated this passage of trust between you and this new person, it makes it a lot easier and kind of like mitigates these red flags that might be going off. That it's like, oh, it's like a new person that you don't know like where they're at or where they're coming from. But like Chabu said, I don't know that it's necessarily like the best premise to operate under, because there's probably a lot of people that we're just missing out on these interactions with that we don't share a culture with, but that are bringing obviously so much value just the same.
Yeah, I guess like what I wonder is like, is it that we like trust the people, or like is it just like we trust a culture? Because I guess to me like culture is battle tested. Like lots of people have like, well, ideally like lots of people have been part of this culture before. It clearly works, which is why it has stuck around. And so I guess like to what a lot of people have said about like safety, it's like a lot easier to like trust someone if you know that they are also following this culture that like has worked before.
Yes. I love the stranger danger, pulling that out, because that really is the essence of what you're trying to deal with as you navigate through life. And culture, those common shared mores, values, themes, I break things. I love math because it explains so much about us. And you can there are actually formulas. If you do direct marketing, you get into that, you'll see you can formulate how people are going to act. And culture acts as a means of easing the interactions. It's, my son just turned 21, and he has always bristled at, I've been blessed. I know a lot of people in the world. And, so when he's wanted to do things, I'm like, oh, well, let me call up. And he never wants to utilize that. And I'm saying, but the relationships that are built up, there's a comfort level that people have because a reference is coming from a known quantity. And it's not cheating, it's removing some of that friction that results in interactions. That most people are actually suffer from social anxiety on some level. That's a real thing. And culture and the shared experiences help to mitigate that anxiety that most people have. And so it's a means that we've developed as humans to interact one with another more than just your family unit.
Yeah, I agree with that standpoint. I know I said like culture kind of divides people. I know that's kind of like extreme, but I was more of like talking about like alienation. Not alien. I don't know how to say the word. Alienating. Okay, that's the word.
Right.
Alienating. And right. So if we don't have people who have the shared cultural experiences, people can definitely feel very alienated themselves. And so I think it's more of people trusting the culture rather than people, because if there's like if like the culture itself they can like connect with, they don't feel as alienated themselves. So
Right. Look, it's there's good and there's bad. We do it. I would always explain to people, you have to generalize in life. You can't function. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. If every person you interact with them without generalizing on some level, you end up doing nothing. Now, the challenge is to generalize without being assaulting them, without insulting them, without denigrating them, that's the issue. But generalizations in and of themselves are not bad. It's what we do with them. And what we all have to do is recognize, okay, what is informing us based on our past history, our culture? Where might we go astray? And if we're knowledgeable about that, we can actually interact with people outside of our culture in a meaningful, productive, and expansive manner. That's the goal, ultimately. The problem is when people just get lazy. And I think people are just lazy and they want to fall back on their culture. Well, I don't know them. You'll hear this as you go into the job market. They're not a cultural fit for our workplace. How do you know? Oh, I wouldn't want to have a beer with them. What does that mean? But you could expand your horizons. If you're lazy about it, it's bad. If you're open to it, introspective, and recognize one's biases, and you understand that their culture can make you more and have a broader perspective, that's when it's good. And that's what we should all seek to do and be. So I get worked up about this because we can, unfortunately, I'm so encouraged by you all that it's just, I can't tell you. I want your generation to hurry up and get out there into the world because we need this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that is something that I've seen. And it's this kind of tribal mentality of that, my group over others. And so I definitely agree that when you're in a situation where you don't have really any shared culture, you don't know that you have any. When you face people who at first sight, at least, seem very different, whether they're from different countries, different communities, completely different things, you do have to generalize and you do have to get over this kind of tribalist mentality, and you have to be open to seeing other people, to talking to other people, to having your own view be expanded over what you're familiar with, what you're comfortable, or not necessarily what you're comfortable with, but what you're familiar with. Yeah.
I want to propose a provocation because so many of the insights from this conversation have me circling back to the idea of oh, wow, that makes a ton of sense. How can I apply this? So my provocation is, what cultures are you currently trying to build? And like, how is that experimentation process going? Or what are you learning from that experimentation process?
I can spitball here. I would say my family culture has improved in recent years. I think there's more of a culture of curiosity than before. The previous like philosophy around like reading and learning was like all about making money and getting into good school. But now that my parents are both retired, they learn for fun. They learn for enlightenment. And so, I'm not the one purely, I actually was not very deliberate about creating this culture, but it's like a combination of things. They needed something to do. And then myself and my brother have beeping noise. We kind of openly talk about like the interesting things that we are learning and how we're applying it and how it's making our lives better. Particularly, the thing that really got my dad in particular really interested in reading a lot more was us applying like intermittent fasting, which is like for your health, and other sort of like health related stuff, right? Because they want to combat aging and stuff. And then like, but it's interesting because then my dad, after getting on like a wellness health content binge, then he like started to be curious about other stuff. He like read like Hillbilly Elegy and like this book called Educated, and now he's just like thinking about all sorts of stuff. So I guess my experience there taught me that I guess there's a lot of different factors that can really shape a culture, a family's culture. And then like, but you can also like, after you notice that it's forming, you can like stoke the fire like intentionally as well.
Yeah, I guess something that a culture that I've been trying to build. This is kind of unrelated, or like unrelated to what Gary was saying, but it's kind of in general. I think one that I've been trying to create is one of like thoughtfulness and intellectualness. And so in that, I mean, when we look at our democracy, I think one of the biggest problems is that people, unfortunately, are not given the resources and do not and are not educated enough on politics to, kind of build a really stable democracy. And so we see that there's a ton of disinformation and a bunch of misinformation, which can really mislead people. And obviously, I don't mean to say that like these people's fault. It's obviously because of a lack of resources. And so what I think really what I'm getting at is I think that we need to kind of create an environment where we look at things critically, where we research things, where we really get into it and really have the resources to do so. And so I think just like an example, I know recently everyone's talking about the stimulus checks, right? And I've been seeing all over social media people calling on Biden to like get them through. And I think, with the use of an executive order, and obviously that's one of those like things where, it's not really that big of a deal, but it's like people need to know that he can't do that, right? We need to be able to hold the right people accountable. We need to be able to target the right things. And so for that, we need, the resources and the support to build a like thoughtful, well-researched, open-minded community and culture.
Can I hear you. I want to push back on that because I think we need to hold people accountable more than we do. I know you're being very diplomatic about it. You must come from a diplomat's family in that we have more resources to access information and to process information than people have ever had in the history of humankind. And what we're not doing, and I go back to people taking the easy way out. You might call it lazy, but I see people share things on social media, having researched it, not at all. I see people getting information that is life, that can affect their lives, acting on it without checking anything. I've had friends, highly educated friends, who do this, and I push back at them. Not everybody, but most of our population in the US has access to more information. When I got to Harvard, my freshman year, I was amazed because I lived across from Widener Library, the second largest library on earth. And I thought it was the most amazing thing because all my life I would sit there and go, I wonder, and I'd have to trudge to, we were fortunate to have the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I would go to the library to find out. And I was excited because the second biggest library in the world was right across from my dorm room. So if I said, I wonder, I could go into the library and go through the stacks and find the answer. We carry that in our pocket now. This is amazing. Like, we have this in our pockets, and it's not a lack of resources for the vast majority of people. It's a lack of intent to find out what the truth, to seek out the truth.
Right. Yeah. And that's
with you. But we need to call people on this. Like, look at what you all are doing. You all are investigating. You're seeking answers. You're seeking to expand your minds. We need to challenge people to do that instead of getting information on Facebook and just wildly trusting it and saying, "Oh, there's graphene in the vaccine. Let's not take it because it's gonna." Like, come on, people, read something for real. I'm sorry, it's just
No, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's more so what I meant in sort of resources. Obviously, and I think we're all guilty of this. I mean, right here, like you said, we have literally everything. Like, I could probably get a physics major just off my phone if I really looked hard enough, right?
Right.
And so I think it's when I say resources, I don't mean yeah, like Ashley is saying, that's definitely true. There's a bunch of resources, but a lack of processes. And it's definitely resources in the sense that we get people to explore further, that we get people to think critically, that we get people to really get more involved.
Wait, hold on. Say that again. To what? To think critically. That's so important what you did, to think critically. That's what we need to help people or train people to do. That's exactly it. I mean, I think there's not enough intent on teaching people how to research, on teaching people how to think critically, like you said. That's an important thing. And look, that should be a movement. How do you find things out? We talk about fake news. How do you find real news?
I want to interject here and just like when you mentioned how to find information, you'd have to actively go put in labor to go find it. Like, it wasn't a matter of just typing it in very quickly. You had to go seek the information out. And so the culture around learning was very much reflective of the fact that if you went through the tedious process of gaining the information, of course the information that you gained was valid. So access to information was equated to understanding something. And I think now, because you don't need to undergo such an extensive process to know something, we still treat it as if finding the information means understanding it. And so there's almost an entirely new component that needs to be added to the culture of learning. Gaining access to it does not mean you know or have enough. If anything, it means that there's probably more that you need to undergo to understand something. And I think that this connects to a culture of learning and what that looks like. For me personally, I am trying to I'm trying to embody the practice of not learning about new things exclusively through nonfiction content or the news. there's nothing about it that's like remotely inspiring, and it's very rarely insightful. And so I've begun to have like a huge emphasis on reading personal narratives or trying to get content from people who experience it firsthand, because because the distinction between knowing something and understanding it is, I can't even begin to get into it. But having learned about like different cultures or historical events through the lens of the people who were actually there is super, super, super informative, because you see not only the events that went down, but then also how it impacted people on like an emotional capacity in the way that they engage with the world, and then the way that they kind of see the events that follow, what lens they look through. And so that's kind of a connection between like a culture that I'm trying to build within myself, that learning isn't contingent on like nonfiction articles and the news and things like that. Like there's so much more depth to it, and it should have the connotation of being exploratory and never ending and full of nuance with like a lot of different layers to it.
That is so wonderfully insightful, what you just said. What you have just taken the conversation, you brought us full circle, because so much about what is real is predicated on understanding the culture that is informing the people who are creating the information that you're processing. And so, yeah, if you just read, nonfiction or whatever, but my concentration in college was one that synthesized, it was a bunch of academics who decided to start a major called social studies. And the reason was they believed that the standard way of learning about government economics or whatever was flawed, because in order to truly understand what was being said, you needed to understand the historical context, the social context, the family context, all of the people who created these theories that we hold so dear and in such esteem. And if you understand the full picture, you then understand, you have a deeper understanding of why things are coming out the way that they are. And you're doing that on your own. That's wonderful. That's how you get real understanding and understand why people, for me, I can't be mad at, we're so polarized politically, but if you go back and you look at the cultures that people are coming from, you can actually understand why their points of view are what they are. And then you're able to communicate with people who may hate you, but you can understand why they do. It's not about you personally, it's about the historical context, the family context, that they've come up in. And then it's easy because it's no longer personal. It's just what it is. That's democracy. So democracy needs a cultural understanding and informing in order to function appropriately, or the way that we desire it to ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone just said. But for me, right now, I'm trying to connect more of a, like, connecting my differences in terms to my family, because like me and my parents were very, very similar to each other, but we're also very, very different, right? And even though we have like a deep understanding of like our similarities, we lack like understanding of each other in terms of our differences. So what I'm trying to do is like trying to build a culture of myself and my family on, understanding the identities aspect of each other that are very, very different. Yeah.
Okay, as a parent, do you think that's because, I'll ask you, because you have come up in a culture that's very different from anything that they ever experienced? Right. Okay, so that's it. I mean, it's because you have, as we talked about in this conversation, you have different cultures that will inform who you are and what your identity is. And so your challenge is that part of that cultural identity that you hold is entirely foreign to your parents. And as a parent, it's really hard to understand that this child that you hold so dear actually has a life outside of you. And the crazy part about being a parent, and I'll say, like, I didn't believe any of this stuff. I had people tell me my age when I was your age, all this stuff, and I was like, yeah, whatever. But it actually comes true. But the paradox of parenting is, and that you have to come to grips with, is if you do your job right, your child doesn't need you when they grow up. That's the paradox. And it is so hard, but that's what your job is to do, is to make them not need you and be that separate, whole individual that can function independent of you.
Ashley's never
So
read
well said.
something more.
That is very well said. No, I feel like we could have an entire conversation on parents.
We should.
and
We should.
We should,
Yeah,
yes.
we need Ed back.
You
Yeah.
all are wonderful. I just as you give me hope for the world.
Ed, do you have like an extra like 10 minutes so we can do like the reflection section?
Yeah, what time is it? Yeah, I have a 6:45. So
Okay, cool, great. All right, Ashley, should we get to the reflection? Great.
Yes. So I just dropped the link to the notes in the chat if you want to go back and look at what people have said. But yeah, we can go in any order with the reflection. Just anything that you took away from the trip today.
So for me, I definitely learned a lot. Like these are like very complicated. Well, I mean, yeah, cultural like is definitely complicated, but like I learned a lot in terms of like I can't even explain it. Like that's how complicated it is. But yeah, just overall, I learned a lot in terms of like how culture was complicated again, and also the paradox aspect of it, like the differences and like unification as well. And yeah, I have no words.
Yeah, I think I can kind of put like my takeaway in very simple words, and that basically I think one of the main takeaways that we need to try to apply in life is to create a culture of doing things. So whether that's, you know, digging deeper for more knowledge, whether that's understanding other people despite huge differences and finding similarities in those, or any of the other things that we talked about, I think what we really need to emphasize is a kind of culture that's, you know, a go-getter kind of culture to get up and go see the world for what it is, I think.
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump out of my seat that you said. One of the things I say, people say a lot of things, look at what they do.
Looking back at earlier questions and provocations, it made me realize how much our relationship with culture reveals that even as humanity progresses so much, we still have so many primal instincts that we act upon and need to be fulfilled. So the conversation with culture and identity and that need for people to feel a sense of community, and how much culture shapes people's identity and their relationship with the world, and also other things like trusting people who are a part of the same or similar cultures to you. So that's just something that I realized, and it's interesting how we still very much rely on those instincts.
I'm sorry, I have to pop in again. You all are. So I just posed this question. Is culture a response to our need to enable ourselves to interact one with another by conquering our primal natures?
My instinctual reaction is to say that it is both a reflection and a reaction of all of those things. Like it represents what we are, but then also how we perceive and kind of react to what we are. And I'm just gonna jump in with like my reflection here. I feel like this was such an incredible conversation in the sense that it's not necessarily a new topic. It's not, and it's definitely not one that I'm unfamiliar with, but just through the process of like talking it through, there's just a lot of value on ruminating on something that you theoretically understand, especially in the presence of other people. So I think it was really insightful in the sense that it brought new depth to to things that I theoretically understood on culture. So thank you all for participating and being a part of that.
I love that, Chabu. And I think that like I definitely relate on your point of like ruminating more on things because quite honestly, I thought this track was on building community. And so when I came and it was on building culture, I was like, oh, I wonder what direction this will be because I just wasn't sure. Like I never really had thought that much about culture like individually aside from community and things like that. So definitely enjoyed this conversation. And I think one of my own personal takeaways is on social culture because I know we were talking about that a lot, and I think being more intentional in the ways that I approach different people and not really sticking to, I guess, my normal crowd is something that I want to try and do more, especially as I have the ability to with things opening up. And I think, you know, my time at home has definitely made me want to do that a little bit more. But like we were talking about earlier, I think we have a tendency to stick to people that are similar to us or at least outwardly similar to us. I definitely want to make a conscious effort to start engaging with different groups and trying to gain those new perspectives. So thank you all for this track.
Happy to jump in. There's so many great points here. I thought this is one of the best treks we've had. One thing I think, well, I'm gonna definitely try to apply to my life is being more self-aware about how the default is awkwardness, unless it's someone else that is trained to be the one to combat it by being the more social one. And so I guess finding the commonalities between you and the other person, I'm going to be more deliberate about that because it really does. I think Ed mentioned this, like people are always just trying to figure out how they act, right, based on what they know about you. So I think the sooner that you can reveal something that relieves them, allows them to drop their guard is the better. The sooner the better.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what has been said. I think so many just really amazing insights from this track. I think something that like really stood out to me though was was it was something that Chabu said about like needing to like knowing like a culture from a textbook is very different from like experiencing a culture. And when you learn about cultures, like you want to learn about it from the people who have had experiential knowing of like the processes and like just what that culture actually embodies. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, well, thank you all yes, for being on this trek with us. I guess Ed, since this was your first track, what did you think about the trek format?
This is
Again, what are your
fantastic.
thoughts on
This is great. I'm no words, which is rare for me. I'm so impressed. You all are fantastic, and the thoughts. I love that. You know, the thought you put into the conversation and the depth of thought is just so impressive. I'm sitting here going, they have to be older. They have to have experienced more, and it's really encouraging. Really, really, and truly encouraging. I just thank you. This was a blessing to me, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was really great to have you. So we definitely need to have a second, another track. Roman, I know it was
Yeah.
also your first track. How was it for you?
I thought it was a really insightful experience, and I think it's definitely something that I'll keep thinking about. Especially on that note, like Ed's final question about like, primal nature compared to culture and everything. I think that's definitely, like sparking a whole bunch of different thoughts and ideas. But yeah, I thought it was a really insightful conversation. I thought the environment was great, and I look forward to participating in more of these.
It was really awesome to have both of you here, and thank you so much everyone for joining for this track. Just really grateful for all of you.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
See you.